Well, it wasn't all those many years ago when man found that he could ride on two wheels. And then he learned to put an engine in it, and then motorcycling began. And what a great sport it has been, what a great essential service it has been, and now with classic bikes, what a great hobby it is. Fine examples of these bikes on every show field now. Definitely there's one of my favorites there, the old B31 BSA. It's a wonderful movement, a great camaraderie amongst the owners of bikes, not only here on the shows, but it always was back in the early days of motorcycling. I hope it still exists now, when if a motorcyclist had a problem on the side of the road, another one comes along, there was always that brotherhood there. We've built some wonderful motorbikes in our time in this country. AJS, for example, there, a great popular machine with the young lads in the post-war years, this particular model. Just look at the clean lines there of the primary chain case with that extra little bit of finish around the outside. And there, a bike made by a firm that made some of the most attractive bikes ever, Triumph. That's known as the bathtub model. And you don't have to be very bright to see why. It was Triumph's attempt at streamlining back in the early 60s when scooters were very popular and they still wanted to retain the image of the motorcycle and appeal to both sides. So they brought this streamlined bit on the back end, and they were quite a nice bike to ride too. Now the famous twin, the BSA twin, this is called the unitary construction twin, where later on in years we did away with the old primary chain case and the separate gearbox. It all went into one, trying to clean up the lines. I'm one of the old school. I like to see all the old separate bits, but still that's a matter of choice, depending on the year we were born in. Built like a gun was the motto of the Royal Enfield you see here. Another Midlands firm. Never had much of a racing history, but their competition and the trials records are very high indeed. A great bike. And you can still buy a bike with Enfield on the side now, built following the old Royal Enfield bullet pattern. A firm in India still build one called the Enfield. So, credit to the old firm, eh? Beautifully polished full-width drum brake on the front. Yes, there's a bike here for every sort of enthusiast when you visit these shows, and usually the riders are hanging around there waiting to talk to you about them. Now, a sister to the AJSs that we spoke of later is Matchless. Actually, Matchless bought out AJ Stevens many years before the war and built very similar bikes. There were just subtle little changes, and mechanically they were basically the same, but you still get some people would rather have an AJ than a Matchless and vice versa. One of our great twins was the Norton Commando. Here we see a nice 750 version built by Norton, the firm who I suppose showed us more about racing bikes than any other over their historic years. A great firm indeed. But where are they now? No. What's happened to our motorcycle industry? It's very sad, really, to think that so many great names have now gone down the drain, and all's left now is the name Norton with a very big owners club. The other badge on the right there, that's the Bridge End Motorcycle Club. The famous name of BSA, Birmingham Small Arms. They built a bike for everybody. Everything from the small two-strokes, your well-known Bantam, up to the big twins and triples. For the competition man, the Gold Star was second to none. That's the 650 Lightning. Of course, the first 650 they built was the ever-faithful Gold Flash back in the 50s. Triumph, of course, as we see here, they were the originators of the parallel twin. Ed Turner, he designed it back in the 30s. And after the war, these bikes got so popular that all the other leading makes, Norton, Aerial, Triumph, BSA, they were all there producing the parallel twins. First of all, 500s, then you went up to 650, 750. and so on. Another famous name that was great in the competition world during the 60s was Greaves. They used mainly Villiers engines, but the frame design was somewhat different to most. It had different linkage on the front forks and made it a very easy bike to ride and handle, much better handling than the old conventional frames. And Greaves has certainly got a high competition record. But Villiers engines, well, they were a firm that built two-stroke engines in thousands, all through the 30s and 40s, and lots of firms just built frames and cycle parts and bought in Villiers engines to put in their bikes. One such firm, of course, Excelsior. Although they did make full bikes back early on in their days, but the post-war saw them make little lightweight go-to-work bikes, such as this. Cheap running, probably just a little two-speeder, with a small two-stroke engine, simplicity and reliability by Villiers. Now one of the bigger Royal Enfields. Beautifully made bikes. And Royal Enfield managed to produce an engine with a good bottom end power to it. They're very popular among the sidecar man. This is probably why they never did a lot of high-speed racing. It wasn't always that important, although it was a good sales factor to have a high top speed. But everything you do over the 80, 90 miles an hour, you sort of lose a bit of power down the bottom end. Royal Enfields always seem to hit a right side of this and produce a darn good gutsy bike. Not standardly fitted with stereo though. And what's more well known than the old Norton single overhead, either the Model 18 or the ES2, that's the old Model 18, pre-war with a girded forks. Look, what a great machine. That old engine's characteristic went on for many years with a 79 bore 100 stroke, and it just didn't change, and they kept improving little bits here and there. And that primary chain case known as the Norton oil bath, I don't know why, you used to get a bath of oil out of it every time you put one in it. I think they had to be properly put on to be oil tight. Just one little extra pinch of the outer nut and you'd had it. Francis Barnett, another of those firms that built mainly frames and put the Villiers engines in. A famous firm from many years, again, post-war years, producing bikes for the working man, a cheap, economic way of going to and from work, because not many people could afford cars in those days. Might be utility, but certainly good looking. And here's another example here, little James. They made the Cadet and the Captain and the Commodore, depending on the size of the engine. Known, of course, here as you see the famous James. Very old firm. One of my favourites, that though, the old PSA B31, a 350 overhead valve engine. Reliable. And here they are going to have a ride around the ring now. This is what we like to see and hear and smell them. Hear the different sounds, the parallel twins that we have here. The singles, the two-strokes, four-strokes, sometimes four-cylinder. The commentator here stopping to have a chat with each one in turn. It's a bit difficult to arrange a motorcycle parade because if they wait outside to come in one at a time, with the old type clutches, you had to hold it on the clutch out there. Clutches used to get hot. And if you let them tick over too long, even out of gear, the old air-cooled engines tend to warm up a little bit. It's rather difficult to arrange these motorcycle parades if you've got a hell of a lot of them. Comes the Commando. Good road holding bike. Norton was always noted for its road holding.
The Home 3-wheeler, of course, is front-wheel drive. Maximum manoeuvrability.
It's a smaller BSA, one of the last of the Bantams. The Bantam started its life back about 1949 and went on for many, many years. This one decided to bring a passenger around with him. Probably to enjoy the stereo in the box on the back. That's not a B-31, that's the swinging arm model. By that time they got a little bit heavy for a 350, although they did put a 500 engine in as well, the B-33, and very manageable for different years. 2-speed, just a little lever on the handlebars to change gear. AJS competition model, very popular back in their days. I think there's a man by the name of Hugh Viney used to ride for AJs back in those days, international 6-day trials. And a bike like this nowadays, a competition model, is very collectible and worth a bit of money. Everyone anxiously looking to see who's coming in next. They all love to chat about each other's bikes. It's a great following and a great fraternity, as I said earlier. They all get on well together. I love the motorcycle sections. Now there are competition bikes, always collectible, and some of the little ones, not always willing to go. That's it, give it a bit of help with a foot. They all have their individual knack on bikes. You don't have self-starters on these old things. If you set them up right, you can usually rely on a first kickstart, but if you get it wrong, you could have trouble for quite a while. One of our BSA twins, the A10. Matchless twin and the Norton twin. We seem to be doing well for twins on our parade today.
Motorcycle power unit in there, driving the front wheel, that gives you catch on the volt, so front wheel drive, same as you would find with a normal...
Ah, they aren't all British, are they? We've got our American big brother here now, the Harley Davidson. I suppose one of the most famous bikes in the world now. I don't particularly want one, but they're a different sort of bike. You don't ride on them, you more or less get in them. There's a huge, comfortable machine there, V-twin, long-distance cruising. Of course, designed for a different job to our bikes. Designed for those big American highways where you had mile on mile of road. So you just sit back there and wind it on and cruise along happily. But when it comes to going across country or doing anything a little bit off the beaten track, you can't whack the British bikes. But certainly, the American Harley Davidson, their marketing now is, I suppose, the greatest in the world. Another little bike there, Sun. They, too, produce the frames and stick their Villiers engines in. Just another of the many post-war firms who did just this, because motoring became essential. The lads come out of the army, fed up with going back to push bikes again, couldn't afford a car, they're all looking for little bikes. And people like Sun, Excelsior, James, etc. did well. And here we see a photograph of how it was found. So someone's done a lot of work down in the garden shed to get it back to its original condition. Another old Birmingham firm that started back before the 1930s. But what a satisfying thing to have found that wreck and then brought it back to this condition. And look at this condition. Another of our great triumphs. These were so popular for export too, and a lot of them have come back to this country again. The Americans loved them. They certainly outperformed the American bikes. They're lighter to handle and much quicker. How's that for restoration? Better than new, I would say. The name Bonneville, of course, another good advertising gesture towards selling them in America. Yes, Triumph certainly made the most beautiful of all bikes. They paid special attention to the mudguards and frame and streamlined the whole thing, and I think their design was by far the prettiest of it all. There's another, the bathtub one. It's a different colour. This, the maroon one, is the 500 twin, whereas the early one we saw was the 350, and they also built a 650, the Thunderbird. Always have a great following, Triumphs. Still being produced today, which is what we can say about none of the others. Very sad. Many stories have been told as to the reason of the demise of the British motorcycle. No one will claim responsibility for it, but we certainly lost out being the prime producer.
Tell me what it's all about. That the heavy haulage down.
That's the Royal Enfield bullet, and if you saw the Enfield bullet now produced in India, you would see a great similarity. Now, we spoke about a Francis Barnett, effectively known as Fanny Barnett. This is about a 1936 or 7 Francis Barnett here. It was fully enclosed, known as the Cruiser, and a lot of forward thinking. It's a pity our motorcycle industry after the war weren't as forward thinking as some of the firms were before the war. Had they done that, and had we accepted it, then we'd have still had a lot of bikes on the road today. Another of the old go-to-work bikes produced just after the war by BSA. That's the C11. That's a 250 overhead valve, only a 3-speed gearbox. Speedometer set in the top of the tank for a cheap bike, less than £100, and quite reliable. Coil ignition too, which was a good step forward in the post-war years. A little bit of renovation needed here, but sometimes I think it's nice to see the old original look. Now, this is something that was popular just before the war and after. The Autocycle, long before they were called mopeds. Built by many firms. This is the Renault. They were also built by Rudge Whitworth, Excelsior, Sun, Bound, etc. Just a cycle frame. Of course, easy for people who weren't used to motorcycling to convert from a pedal cycle. There's the simple speedometer drive from the front wheel. There she is, the BSA Bantam. The engine design was pinched from DKW just after World War II had finished. And it went on to be a very famous little engine, especially in this, the competition model. Utter reliability. I once saw BSA Bantam advertised in the poultry column. Another old timer here. This gives example with the old Calthorpe Jap. Now, don't associate that name with the Japanese. It's J.A. Prestwick of London. He produced many an engine for not only stationary engines, but of course motorcycling. Good engine builders, but This is really going back in years now with the famous old belt drive. Wet weather, they didn't have slip, and with the old band brakes that you can see there, they didn't stop very easily either. But that was motorcycling in its difficult days. The old side valve engine there, look, non-detachable head, the little leather bag on the side for the tools, no locks on them, nobody pinched your tools in those days.
Come to the commentary point.
Used to go to the pictures right up until the 40s and 50s and just throw your leggings and overcoat over the saddle, which was still there when you come back. Times have changed now, and that's the oiler there to show the flow of oil going to the engine. You had to pump your pressure, and the famous name of Brooks on the saddle. The old acetylene lighting. Ah, those were the days. Bags of levers to play with to control your ignition and your air. I'll bet that one draws a crowd. Another good old timer here, sporting the name of Bound Villiers, because even in those days fitted with a Villiers engine with that big outside flywheel and once again belt drive. A rare old timer is that. If you find one like this, well, hang on to it. Rare models such as this are worth their money. Once again, the old oil pump, and you could gauge on the left there the amount of oil flow that was required. Ah, now someone looking at something a little bit different there, and here we have the container for the acetylene, the carbide, to keep the old lamps going. You see the old engines there, you see no detachable head on them, no electric horn. Douglas, a famous name, built in Kingswood in Bristol. Always made a great bike, invariably a twin-engine bike, and even went on to produce some good bikes after the war. But this is very old. This is one of the very early ones. Douglas, too, a name that earned fame on grass and speedway. Very fast bikes. Never seemed to get their marketing going, their production, and had lots of financial problems. And Scott too, there's an engine there, a parallel twin, water-cooled, that was designed, what, 60 odd years ago, probably more, and they went on keeping that same engine after the war. They were the Birmingham Scott, and then the famous firm of Silk still produced that engine. So it just shows the soundness of that particular design. Another firm with a good racing background, Scott's. Parallel twin water-cooled two-strokes. This is the sort of thing that our Far Eastern friends advertise now, thinking it's something new. And we were doing it back just after World War I. There's nothing sounded like a Scott either. They're always known as the yowl of the Scott. They've certainly got their share of oldies here today. Another great firm that didn't produce after the war, the New Hudson. They did produce Autocycles, but their old motorcycle manufacturing just died out in the 30s. But another great bike. Always picked the Scott out with that great radiator and a very unusual shaped petrol tank on them too. Note the hand change, something you'd never sell a bike with nowadays, would you? You can see there the damper on the forks. That is to damp your spring on your suspension. No teleforks in those days. Everything sound mechanical ideas, no sophistication, but a treat to ride and enjoy, especially this old competition Norton, a very sought after bike. A lot of these bikes here are fairly common and fairly easy to come by as far as classic collectors are concerned, but others are rare and most collectible. So if you do decide to join the classic and vintage bike circle, then you've got to decide whether you want something that's just nice to ride or something that's nice to own. A nice lineup here of bikes from the 50s and 60s. And now we're going to have another chance to show off the sound of these old favourites as they trundle around the ring once more. It's a great day for these old bikers here because they can go around the ring, not lumbered with crash helmets and riding gear, nice bit of sunshine, and riding in a nice free way, the way we used to years ago before the dangers on the road reached the scale that they have now. It's nice just sitting there with a good hot bike between your knees and hands drop down on those handlebars, and you suddenly get the urge to wind it up. And that old-timer there is probably reminiscent over those days of yore, thinking about the things I've just been mentioning. Points of interest, always to be noted by the enthusiast. Some of them critical about not having the right footrest or the right markings on there. And here we have our first combination we've seen in this little show. The cheapest form of transport ever. Only half the price of the normal insurance to run a combination. Certainly much cheaper than the car, and I think the Mini was the one who eventually came in and gradually put the motorcycle combinations off the road. What a fine lineup. Of course, number plates too, some of them aren't the correct age. Most of these appear to be quite genuine and original. It is possible now to get age-related numbers if you haven't got the correct number plate on your bike. There's another real collector's piece there, the BSA Gold Star. BSA produced their Gold Star as their competition model for many years, since before the war. And at one time, the Clubman's TT over in the Isle of Man, it became a little bit boring to see them at the top of the scale on each of those events. Another famous old single by Triumph, either the Tiger 90 or Tiger 80, that one. One of the later Matchlesses, when Matchless and AJ all became the AMC, Associated Motorcycle, and they're one of the early Plunger Gold Flashes. A lot of bathtub Triumphs. Certainly a love-hate bike. You either love them or hate them, because the old open work motorcyclists really frowned on the Triumphs when they enclosed the rear wheel in this way. Famous old name of Excelsior. Didn't go much on his paint finish on there. A couple more Triumphs here, certainly the most popular or common of all classic bikes because of their long run of production. The Aerial Arrow. Aerial leaders and aerial arrows were very forward-thinking in their design. Press-steel construction, twin two-stroke, a very nice handling little machine too, with a good turn of performance. But once again, the British motorcyclist, the old stick in the mud that he was, sort of frowned on them. But there are a lot of people looking for them now. Aereo could see the way ahead long before Mr. Average Motorcyclist could. There's the BSA combination, a sidecar possibly by Watsonians, a firm that's been making sidecars for many, many years and still in production up there in the Cotswolds now. Took a bit of getting used to riding the combination after riding the solo. You've got to forget all about balancing, which is quite difficult when you're sat on the same machine that you've been balancing for a long time. And the windscreen, that was always popular to them. You would always find that on the man who rode to work regularly. The sporting motorcyclists tended to poo-hoo you if you put a windscreen on your bike, but you ride backward and forward to work regularly, 5 and 6 days a week. You were half glad to have a windscreen on there. Another big Bonneville. The Silver Jubilee model, I see. Once again, an issue like that would certainly add a lot of money to the cost and value of your machine. There's a bike I'm very fond of, it's Velocette. This is one of the old Cami Velos, the overhead camshaft model, which had a wonderful racing pedigree back in the 30s, and of course just post-war too. A great machine, not one of the big husky heavy bikes, but everything was reasonably lightweight and finely machined, and there are a lot of very proud Velocette owners about now. And just look at that for a record. Another famous make of SOS, the Super Onslow Special. And at this point in time, Mr. Onslow is still riding a motorcycle well up in his 90s. I think it's his ambition to ride a motorcycle on his 100th birthday. A grand old fellow who built some grand old bikes. Now, you get a number plate on an old bike like this, you get a lot of collectors would buy it and sell the number plate. But thank heaven this proud SOS owner hasn't done just that. A lot of this happened at auctions. And here's the famous Brockbank Corgi, based on the wartime well bike that was designed to fold up and go into the airborne gliders so that the troops had some form of communication when they reached the ground. And these little Corgis were very popular in post-war years. They were cheap. Little two-stroke Villiers engine, of course, in there. You just kept them in the passage at home, if you like, and popped down the shop with them, or sometimes to work. Another bike well worth finding is the Sunbeam. After the war, BSA's made Sunbeams to produce a very sophisticated shaft-drive twin. But before the war, they were the big singles. Ultimate in reliability, known as the gentleman's motorcycle, and the superb finish on them was second to none, because Sunbeams also owned a firm that made paint, a sort of lacquer, and they used the bikes to advertise their product. Everything was black, whereas a lot of bikes sported their chrome finish tanks and rims. Sunbeam kept to the black, and what a superb black it was. It lasted for years. Yes, there's some fine engineering in the Sunbeam. Something different now, a little three-wheel tricycle. It's the Bond mini car, fitted with a Villiers two-stroke engine. These little cars were designed to give a bit of weather protection to the normal motorcyclist, and very good they were too. A cruising speed of about 40 miles an hour, on a flat road that is, and a fantastic turning circle, because that engine was mounted on the front wheel, and it would turn through about 90 degrees. So you can just imagine the pirouette that you could get out of those, which made it a very easy vehicle to park. And a lot of the young ladies enjoyed the little Bond mini car to go to work in. Very simple in construction, but the main point was you were in the dry. Certainly not in the dry here. You would be in the sidecar. This is a good old Royal Enfield V-twin combination. And look on the right-hand side there. That's not a kickstart. That's actually a hand start. You wind them up. And that's a good old bike. Belongs to a vintage motorcycle club owner that's done many a rally and many a road run. It's pretty high mileage per year. There she is, that V-twin, 1000cc engine, fixed head cylinders. Take them right off to do your decarbonising, unless you take the big plug out there and clean out, because decarbonising was quite a regular thing after about 3,000 or 4,000 miles on the old fuels back in the early pre-war days. Long before autos reached the fantastic quality that they are today, the life of a motorcycle engine was rather short and lots of maintenance was done, hence the simplicity of their construction, so that the average owner could do most of his own work with a little bit of tinkering and a little help from his friends. Scooters too became very popular because of their weather protection. We imported a couple of ideas from abroad and also produced some of our own, and even enclosed some of our small mopeds. So here you see examples now of when, I suppose, our fraternity is getting a little softer and want a little bit better weather protection. But we went through an era when this was so. And then, of course, in the 60s, Hondas, Suzukis, as you see here, came over from Japan with their high-revving little engines that our motorcyclists said they won't last 5 minutes, but they've certainly shown us what they can do in the motorcycle world. So now we even have Japs long enough here to be eligible for a classic bike parade. BMW made this machine, the Deemster, which was a very popular high-powered scooter, and it was popular and bought by a lot of police forces. Hence the blue light on this particular one. I don't know what force it belonged to, but it was a good size, comfortable bike, ideal to house a bobby, and good suspension too. And here we have a typical example of a pre-war, sort of late 30s bike. Overhead valves, just separate push rod tubes, hand change, and built by BSA, as many of the pre-war bikes were. Birmingham Small Arms, the producer of bikes for everybody, has always been my statement. And here's a fine example of one of the good old reliables that they built. Rigid back end, girder forks, you see, none of the luxuries. Another example too were by Aerial. Aerial always made a habit of putting the dashboard in the top of the tank, which was something they continued in early post-war years. Aerial, another firm that eventually amalgamated with BSA's, with no racing history, but certainly good competition history. The great Sammy Miller earned all his fame in the competition and trials world on an Aerial. Now we've got another BSA here. A great name in the motorcycling world was the Round Tank BSA, and here she is, a fine example of her. Side valve engine, Not belt drive, you can just see the sprocket for the rear chain drive on this particular one, but she did have the huge band brake on the back and, of course, carbide lighting. And what I think as youngsters, how my cousins and I just about wrecked a similar bike to this that we gave £2 for. What would it be worth today? Well, they're by way of a contrast as the 50s Gold Flash. Another friend of mine had one of these, nearly lost his life with it, but got better and went back motorcycling again. That's the way they made them in those days. Had them, we were only too pleased to have something that would balance on two wheels with a bit of power between our knees so that you could wind up and go. And another famous name here, HRD, later to become Vincent of Stevenage. Remember, they produced those huge big twins, the Rapide and the Black Shadow. Real classic bit of engineering, this. Certainly a bike well worth looking out for, but with all these bikes, the next question is, where are we going to find them? Perhaps we can help you to take a classic motorcycle on parade.
Hello, my name is Gerry Burr. Today I'm at the Bath and West Showground at Shepton Mallet, where twice a year Palmer Snell's hold a motorcycle auction. Not just any old motorbike, but classic and vintage motorcycles. And we want to take you around the area today to help you with a little bit of advice on how to buy a good second-hand classic bike, or even buy bits and pieces to add to the bike you've got. Well, I've got an old friend here with me this morning, Jeff Clue. He's the consultant here at the auction. He's also the author of many motorcycle books. Jeff, the question we want to get clear now before we talk about this buying bikes is the various categories that bikes come in. Now, we talk about vintage and we talk about the old veteran. Can you give us the dates of these?
Yes, they're fairly clear cut now because the Vintage Motorcycle Club established these some years ago, and most people now follow the broad pattern, but starts really from the year dot when they first came into being to the end of 1914, and that's what's accepted for the Pioneer run and so on.
Yeah.
Vintage runs from the beginning of 1915 right through to the end of 1930. Then you come into a pre-war category, which takes you up virtually to the wartime years, because obviously not many bikes were made during the war years. And then after that you get the post-vintage, and in the case of the Vintage Motorcycle Club, the cut-off mark is 25 years. Anything that's less than 25 years isn't eligible. Now, there is a lot of confusion over this because a lot of people use the word classic, but classic is a word you can't really define.
There's no such animal, is there?
No, so there's all kinds of interpretations of that.
That's fair enough. Well, thanks, Jeff, and we'll be chatting to you later on about any other problems we come across. Much obliged for your help.
Right, okay.
Well, in one of these boxes, there might well be just the bit you're looking for. But for some people, they will find an item such as this old engine here, and that could be the starting point of a classic or vintage motorbike for them. It's a hard way to do it, but you take it away, and then from then on, it's a long time and a lot of expense before you find the other parts. A lot of research has to be done. You sometimes buy a box with all the bits of that motorcycle allegedly in there. But be careful, you might find bits of lawnmower or anything in the box with you. These are known as basket cases. But that's the hard way to do it. But still, some people get about it that way, and they've got the pride of having done it all themselves. But here we are. Take your pick. Well, this is the next stage up to the basket case. It's mostly there, but still lots of other bits to find. Before you consider your budget, bear in mind that you can buy something like this quite cheaply. But what are you going to spend, not only in money, but in time, renovating the saddle, buying a new one, the paintwork, are you going to do it yourself? You've got no chain, you've got to get a new chain. Your levers, can you get the correct levers? There's a lot of things to consider when you buy something in this condition. You'll often find a bike in a little bit better condition than this, it's even rideable, but it still wants more done to it. Bear in mind all those details, the costs, because it's surprising what time and money you can spend and end up with something that you spend a lot more on than you'd ever see for it again. This is a typical example of how much work you want to do, how much you want to spend in the first place, and how much can you do. Can you get the bits for it? Can you do the paintwork? This is something you really got to consider. You can look at some of these bikes and think, yeah, I could do that, but there's a lot of work to be done and a lot to be spent on a project like this. So do you want to buy something this condition, or really go to the top and think you've got something that wants no more time or money spent on it? At the other end of the scale, we've got a little bike like this Mondial. Beautifully prepared, beautifully restored and finished bike that, in all intents and purposes, is ready for you to ride. Something to enjoy, and it's different. It's a proper showstopper. It's going to catch a lot of interested eyes wherever you go. All right, you can afford it, you're going to take it home and buy it. But if anything did go wrong, can you get the bits for it? One thing you've got to consider very seriously if you're going to buy a classic bike is how much have you got to spend? The budget. When you've saved up a certain amount of money, don't think that's all you're going to spend on that bike. You've got to have a little bit to spare, because there may well be some extra bits to buy, and of course you've got to insure it. So look into all these things very carefully before you come along here prepared to pay a given amount of money.
Father, John this morning.
Well, we've showed you the basket case and the part assembled bike, and this is what we would call well sorted and up and running. It's a nice looking bike. It's all there. Check that it's all there. Check that you got your lights are working, your cables are all working, all your levers are there, the rubbers, good exhaust pipes, and then listen to it and have a go on it. Ride it up and down the road. Check it all through, because you know you're paying a good price for a machine like this. You aren't going to win any posh prizes with it, but you can get a lot of enjoyment. But go through everything mechanically, right from your tires, your chains, your engines, and your cycle parts. Should give you a lot of happiness then if you got it all right. Now, if you're really looking for something nice, well, look for something in the Concours line, like this Triumph Bonneville. If you've got something like that, you'll always be welcome at the show. People will gather around, because this is one of the 650 Bonnevilles and very sought after. This is something that if you spend your money on, you've got to bear in mind that you spent a high premium, and you won't have much change left out of a few £1,000s on this one. But it's nice to own, and you've got something here that hopefully you can ride and enjoy and show on many occasions. But before you buy them, make sure it's running nicely, because although the thing is in Concours condition, you want to find out what it's like inside there as well. I'm now standing with Peter Clark, a well-known face, part of the furniture here at the Palmerston Auctions for many, many years. Peter, now what we're doing today, we're trying to give advice to people coming along to buy a classic bike here at an auction. Now, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would suggest that they get here in reasonable time and to have the opportunity of looking at the bikes carefully, picking out the ones that they perhaps favour, and making certain that they know what they're buying.
What procedures have they got to go through to be able to take part in the auction?
Well, the first thing they have to do, if they intend to bid, then they must go to our desk there and get a bidding slip and a number, so that every person who wants to bid has a number against their name, and when they bid, all they have to do is to hold up the number. I jot it down on the sales slip, and hence we've got the name.
So when they're out there in that massive crowd that I know that you will have here later, you're up there, you've got your good friend up there spotting with you as well. Now, is there any chance that some poor chap here that's got a scratch on the head is going to go away with a bike? You don't...
Well, it doesn't often happen, in fact, very, very rarely, because there's no point in knocking it down to somebody who doesn't really want it at the end of the day. So I think that's a rarity.
So if I were coming along here today, standing out there, I found the bike I want, and you're out there, we have it on the screen, showing the bike up there. Now, what have I got to do? I just got to be aware of how much I'm going to go with the bidding.
Well, you probably have to have a good idea in your own mind as to what you're going to bid up to, and well, stick with it. But obviously, the auctioneer hopes that in the spirit of the auction house, you know, they'll get carried away a bit.
Prices will go
Yes,
down.
that's the whole beauty of an auction.
Well, let's hope you have a good auction, Peter.
That's
Thanks for
very
those
kind.
few words of advice,
Yes.
and let's hope all goes well.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
120, 120, 130, 140, 140,
140, 150, press place 160, 160, 170, 170, 170, at 170, at 170, 80, 180, 190, 190, at 190, at 190, at 190, at 190, you're missing it, at 190, 200, at 200, 210, at 210, at 210, make no mistake, it is for sale, at 210. At 210, the bidding right in the middle, I'm going to sell then at £210. All finished at 210. Number 408, thank you very much.
Well, whether you've decided to build your own bike or buy one complete, one day, as sure as eggs, you're going to have to come to an Autojumble. Here we have a typical example of an Autojumble that goes on in many parts of the country, and interesting places they are to visit, and so necessary. But if you go to an Autojumble looking for a part, no matter how rare, you've got to adopt the attitude, it's out there somewhere. Somebody's got it somewhere, and some parts are difficult to find. So it means rummaging around all these stalls and all these boxes. But sometimes the parts are more plentiful. Make up your mind if you want to find an original part or a pattern part. So a lot of people do pattern parts. If you're going to buy something like a magneto, make sure it works, or if it doesn't work, can you take it back to the stall holder? Bear all these things in mind, because behind us we've got some stall holders with piles and piles of apparent junk, but it's all useful stuff, and we have the specialists there. Let's have a look at some of these specialists. something else to consider, an essential part of your equipment with a classic bike is a manual. Often you've got a friend who can tell you when something's gone wrong and how to put it right. But there's nothing better than have the manual appropriate to your bike that you can sit down and have a read through. Some of these manuals are brief, some are rider's manuals, some are very extensive, but they certainly pay for themselves, so make sure you've got yourself a good book about your bike. Another very important part about buying a bike is the documentation. You've got to have your logbook, and of course eventually you've got to get your certificate of insurance and MOT, but you've got to have an identity with that bike. Make sure that when you're buying it that you've got the correct documents and the engine and frame number on there. They're correct. It's too late. Once you've taken it home, you might never find the person you bought it off again. Very important thing are documents. Don't worry too much about if the number plate has been altered along the line, because a lot of people sell their numbers and they re-register them. If you find that the registration doesn't comply with the year that the bike was manufactured, you can get now, through your local authority, an age-related number with no cost and very little trouble. So we wish you luck in that direction. Another thing, a very fine bit of advice is, once you've got it, you've restored it, you're enjoying it, make sure you keep it. Get a good lock to put on it, and wherever you keep it, make sure it's secure. They're very, very valuable to crooked fingers or motorcycles. Make sure you keep yours. Throughout the day, I hope we've covered the many points necessary for you to go out and do your shopping. There are many pitfalls. I hope we've put you around those, and that you'll become one of the people among the thousands in the world that enjoy classic motorcycling. So put all the facts together, get out there and find yourself a classic bike.